you to Fernando for making this happen. And it's been my first time in Brazil, and I'm wondering why it took me so long to come down here. Tremendously impressed by the seriousness of the debates and the warm hospitality of people as Unisinos, so congratulations, and keep up the good work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read something that I wrote, try to stick to my paper, and then hopefully try to make some connections with other presenters, and then I'm sure that we'll continue with the debates. Also, I just simply want to project, this is my website called Culture Bytes. So if you do not like what you see now, you can always go back to the website, and I have an extensive blog. Also, most of my articles are available free, so you don't have to buy any books. And in that one essay that I just selected is an extensive review article dealing with three recent books by three Latin Americans in the US. John Beverly, Jose Rabasa, and Walter Mignolo. So I'm going to try to be synthetic, hopefully syncretic, but I'm obviously not going to have enough time to develop. But again, if you find this missing, hopefully the writing will be a little bit more convincing. It's an extensive review with not just three recent books or three recent visible Latin Americans in the United States, but also, I think, with a little bit of the current climate and the current debate. So keep that for future reference. You just have to Google my full name and this thing will come up. Post-colonial studies, now increasingly decolonial, have been one of the most provocative fields of scholarly endeavor, at least since the 80s, inside and outside the United States. I got acquainted with it at Duke University in the mid-90s, disrupting previous training, and I still feel 20 years later that something of this achievement must be preserved, particularly now that there is a perception of an impasse inside academic cultures of historical scholarship, never wanting to be just that. But of course, intellectual things and other larger things are not in a distinct cause-effect relationship. We must insert the promises of this field within the general catastrophe, too strong a word perhaps, constituting who we are and who we are not. Let us call our moment that of the post-humanities. The post-decolonial impetus, and perhaps prepositional hesitation has genuine value, is not looking at this catastrophe happy and lucky from afar. Let us make the most of it epistemically and otherwise. Contents. I suppose the content of decolonial thinking is any content with the spin to push it, content and the thinking, towards liberation. Now, easier said than done, the generic formula, assuming we even know what the latter term, liberation, means. Liberatory reason, or at least at the beginning, accusatory reason, the kind of expose that finds fault in modes of analysis, scope and coverage, finding entire areas missing from the landscape of what matters. One big portion, particularly for those of us who make a living, barely, in the US, is Latin America. The kind of content that does not quite fit in between Europe and the US, the two dominant areas, at least where I live. Latin America is indeed a different continent for the conventional Anglo-American monolingual, and I should emphasize this, for the conventional Anglo-American monolingual, Latin America is a continent. So there is an entirely different geographical, geopolitical understanding that doesn't coincide with those of us who also speak Spanish and Portuguese and other Romance languages. So it's indeed a different continent for the conventional Anglo-American monolingual, the kind of presence that is hardly ever there, so its intrusion is very much wanted, particularly when Uncle Sam is undergoing demographic changes which can be called Latin American. The current de-Europeanization has many aspects, and this is one of them. And I said any content because I have of late encountered the adjective post-colonial, decolonial, traveling to fields like food and even the Middle Ages. And any day you will see it keeping company with philosophy and Banana Republic in the clothes stores. Yet I would still say the meaningful intrusion of such uncommon and uncomfortable content has to have epistemic impact. It cannot just be an extension of the same old thing. There's got to be something dramatic, if not drastic change, in the philosophical vision accordingly for a vigorous type of decolonial content. Forms. The decolonial forms can be any forms, I suppose, as long as they break free from pre-established confines and remain provocative, expansive, and wanting. For example, the form of the letter, the obsession with this or that textual form, the universe of this or that native language holding off this or that foreignness, the form or typology of race in a certain time space, the containment within literature, units, or even culture, or even conventional humanities courses. Post-colonial thinking has raised permanent, fatal doubts about schools of thought such as philology, new formalisms, deconstruction, neo-historicism, but also about philosophically informed postmodernism, drawing its main strength from European bases. Not to point fingers at any one in particular, but you could do a very easy exercise in relation to anyone who addresses you with knowledge production. Just take a look at the bibliography that they use in setting up that scenario. Where is the bibliography coming from? Think about it. If those with philosophical ambitions, they tend to really, for the most part, genuflect in front of a certain European tradition that gets repeated again and again. I would situate, but again, this is I'm taking this risk. I would situate decolonial formal dispositions within a certain socio-historicism, the whole emphasis on situated knowledge, embodied epistemologies. That's a little bit how I see the main excitement of decolonial thinking, post-colonial thinking. I wonder about the theme of human rights. I thought about including some comments about human rights, perhaps later in the debate, or even at the end of the talk. I could do that. I come from a place in which the whole language of human rights is profoundly deteriorated and profoundly broken. On the one hand, by foreign affairs circles, mostly clearly close to the US, but also within, we could call them post-structuralist thinking. Vignolo is not very big on human rights, the reinvention of human rights, but also authors like Zizek, also like Carl Schmitt. So I think there's a certain tendency, and I do not want to claim that that's the only vision, but the whole discourse of human rights is, I find it very difficult to move along, and clearly inside the US now is not circulating very much. So I simply want to just present that for this conference. Its preference, the preference of decolonial forms, would be the circumscribing of a situated hermeneutic that contextualizes itself politically, socially, and others with it as well, within a specific horizons of vision which have to be rendered permanently insufficient. No fetishism of this or that form or object of analysis, therefore, no permanent love affair with this or that disciplinary form either. A healthier skepticism towards all discipline appears appropriate, even when there is a certain amalgamation, and consolidation is the euphemism that I'm most used to in the US. When people in the US say, let's consolidate something, they really mean, instead of 20 people doing 20 disciplines, we're going to have 5. We're going to put all the disciplines together, we're going to have only 5. And they call that consolidation of academic expertise. Again, this approach to forms is easier said than done in the confusing dance of disciplinary knowledge negotiating convergence and divergence, when the institutional push is towards such consolidation. And the humanities, which I am happy to represent in this group, are typically considered in one tight bundle, one extreme example, not to mention the whole idea of the foreign languages, literatures and cultures in the contemporary scene. I remember Roberto's presentation about the whole idea of in what language do we have access to knowledge. Well, in the place where I live, there's only one language, I guarantee you that, even though Spanish is the second language, but it doesn't have official status, and within the institutions is grotesquely underrepresented. Frames. The notion of frames of intelligibility brings first the historical supremacy of the West and the desire of a post-West. And in my case, I'm happy to acknowledge the Mexican historiography, authors like Leopoldo Sea and Edmundo Gorman, and this is a wink in the direction of Miguel, which first brought such enterprise to memory and desire. I remember being a graduate student at Duke University and encountering O'Gorman's historiography and Leopoldo Sea philosophical thought, also responding to a certain migratory school of Ortega y Gasset, and I thought, well, these guys are really good. These guys are really good. These guys know European philosophy, but they already problematize their own immediate environment. This is really good. And I can tell you, I don't see anything like that, of that importance, in the in the US context now. Okay, so there are many others, of course, and this is again many other authors, and this is of course again easier said than done. Western frames are deemed insufficient window, repressive setups, Procrustean beds, and they will have to be replaced by what? Hegelian trajectories, still conventional trajectory of putting big units in order, will have to be squeegeed. Squeegee is when you blur the panes. Squeegee and crisscross with others. Which ones? The provincialization of Europe, Chakrabarty's formula. The plurality of options to the Hegelian march of history. We are here in this mess of pluralizing and emphasizing interconnectivity and multidirectionality. And in abstract term, the ever-expanding frame posed of beyond Eurocentrism, which could be Western, which could be European, which could be US universalism, is perhaps the key issue always to bear in mind. A certain style of decolonial reason abhors of any type of universalism, and Mignol is one representative of this. In fact, we can see the D in decolonial as the imaginary pair of scissors that aim at cutting the wings of any type of grand singularity or universalizing disposition. I think yesterday we saw Peter's presentation, and I think it's quite right. A certain type of decolonial thinking always going to go for plurality and difference and divergence, and any one is going to be suspicious, it's going to be problematic. So same and difference, one and the many. The decolonial leans on the second portion of the abstract binary, and there is no doubt that power politics will be manufacturing geopolitical visions of magnitude and long duration. So again, whether you say, I like the many, okay, fine. But I think I'm much more interested in processes of unification and diversification and the mashup of all those processes. And I think we all inhabit those processes in many, many ways at so many levels. How far can we linger in this maze of radically plural particularities or historicisms? We may indeed inhabit a moment of an empty center against which one wants to relativize, particularize, and pluralize. The language of singular gathering, for example, globalization, started in the US in the mid-90s, as far as I'm aware. I remember being a graduate student again at Duke University, and all of a sudden bookstores started having globalization themes, and they devoted entire shelves to the theme of globalization. So you're like, oh, what is this? One has to always be aware of fads and fashions, and so there's all of a sudden globalization. That's why we try to somehow follow up on a certain moment of expansiveness. Now the nation state is insufficient. We have to look at the whole globe. That has also impact on how we teach courses and what kind of thing we do. So and one must endeavor to see the underpinnings of the competing global frames out there. Again, Mignolo's global trajectories, despite himself, also Hegelian narrative, including dissonant or counterpoint voices, and so is Wallerstein and Quijano, among others, and wondering how to go about the theoretical suspension of linearities, periodicities, and teleologies in relation to historical dimensions. Others will see what I do not get to see based on my own trajectory on a specific location at the moment. Functions. I confess to wanting to subsume the content or to etherize the message into the medium. The notion of McLachen's medium is the message. And to push medium into uses or abuses, or the social function. Here, contents, forms, and frames are potentially decolonial, as long as they manage to destabilize, suspend, ever so momentarily, or do damage, ever so partially, to the pre-existing frames of intelligibility, called them the West in the grand singularity. I suppose one can think of social groups, side-by-side institutional function doing various things. What would a decolonial function subsuming previous features be? Something like a pedagogy of the oppressed and a Freire in context of education. Something like greater inclusion of previously excluded social groups from areas of knowledge production. The decolonial impulse inhabits a semi-Western status, a neither nor. If neglected, subordinate, ideally rebellious, Calibanesque conditioning does not end up, I suppose, in the mere respectable recognition at the dinner table. This would be minority or diversity initiatives in the US, very profoundly unsatisfactory. So there's got to be something more daring and more ambitious. I confess to having to pause the moment I consider academic to function and to reason. So we think academic function and academic reason, side-by-side institutions that are capitalist, currently in a state of lack of resources and a state of turmoil. Let's call it existential, even if it is unacknowledged. The disavowal speaks loudly to the severity of such crisis. I called it catastrophic earlier. I'm wondering what the predominant social function of academia is, and the very word academia is so completely degraded in the US that it sounds so old-fashioned, like the humanities. All the entire language that I'm using now is, when I talk to my students, high school students, but also university students, they look at me thinking, what kind of language is that? The entire language is already old-fashioned. It's not operative. I wonder what the impassable horizons of vision, memory, and desire produce within secondary and higher levels of education in the current climate of consumer relations, customer satisfaction models, or increasingly privatized entities, and of systematic de-skilling and professional debilitation from within. There's probably the dominant conception of education in the place where I'm coming from, in which education, high school education, simply feeds the university machine, and the university machine simply feeds the labor force in what the labor force needs. So forget all notions about encompassing thoughts of person, self-improvement, Renaissance models, Enlightenment models. All those models are clearly pushed into a corner for something that is simply feeding the machine, feeding the system in what the system needs. Of Husserlianism doesn't make things any easier. Academia's main function is the dutiful, obedient response to the interpellation of the ideological state apparatus. Remember the Meninas in Velázquez's great painting. I suppose there will be a plurality of institutions and of behaviors in them, but such plurality does not make the panoramic vision of the general landscape any better. Education professionals come mostly from the middling sort in the class structure, petty bourgeoisie, and if you remember what Althusser has to say about them, it's not exactly very flattering. But I suppose that one will have to de-dramatize and affirm the general abstraction that academia is simply one aspect of the social dimension, and the current de-institutionalization of knowledge practices will make academia as relevant as it deserves to be, with new forms, contents, frames, and functions. Knowledge and intelligence or reason meriting the adjective decolonial will have to intervene in any space available, always in the name of such liberatory endeavor. So you see that I'm keeping the previous nouns, contents, forms, frames, and functions in an undefined and open indefinition. I now wish to singularize in quick brushstrokes 5 samples of current scholarship engaging historical dimension, some of them eagerly embracing the level post-colonial, decolonial, others keeping it at a distance, others tactfully repudiating it. There's one type that has to do with warring initiatives wanting to blur conventional Eurocentrism in the name of internationalism of an idealist kind. The case I have in mind is elastic empiricism with no apparent hard lines. Yet when scratched the eggshell, this one type is fundamentally English-based Enlightenment moment of global inspiration, and the US is even also tangential to this symbolic center. This is typically done by expatriate, some cases English scholars in the US, keeping a certain hold, if not monopoly, of a certain Europe in retreat at the moment. And the example that I have in mind is Foundations of Modern International Thought by David Armitage. Again, I don't have time to give you all those form, content, function elements of this book. I'm simply going to just give you a very quick brush stroke and hopefully provoke your curiosity so that you can go back to this type of work. Needless to say, this is modulated foundationalism without going deeply philosophical into anything in particular. The modernity of the frame is conventional Hegelian, but without Hegel. English language-based, deaf to any provocation by any other language. And the singularity of the thought will be the Enlightenment moment, which is also professional field of the author in question. So internationalism, you see, we live in the everyone is doing international all the time. We cannot do anything else but international and global, while also programs of study are shrinking. So it's almost like you have to cover like a bigger portion of the world with fewer resources. Internationalism is big, global, expanse of the same, add America to it, and a bit of Latin America too. Is big with the expanse of the same. The repudiation of the post-colonial in this case, in the case of Armitage, is not so subtle, is not so infirm as not to be undetectable, even if mostly kept in the footnote apparatus and placed in the back of the bibliography. So one has to be very careful with a certain appeal to a certain internationalism which wants to change things ever so slightly so that nothing changes. You may have heard, this is going to have a nice dialogue with Peter's presentation, you may have heard of initiatives among medievalists keen on approaching the label post-colonial. I'm thinking about anthologies such as Post-Colonial Middle Ages by Jerome Cohen, and also of medievalism in the post-colonial world, the idea of the Middle Ages outside of Europe, edited by Kathleen Davis and Nadia Altschul, and of post-colonial moves, medieval through modern, edited by Patricia Clare Ingham and Michelle R. Warren. Things of value do come from medievalists and early modernists, branching out desperately to catch any wind out of a quite brutal and undisguised anti-historicism embedded in US academia. The past, anything before the ineluctable modernity of the 20th century, is hardly ever broached, and it is kaput in some kinds of conventional amnesia that renders meaningless what ignores in equal measure. Questioning legal teleology, particularly the grandiose Hegelian arrangement. Of course, the questioning of the unhappy middle, who wants to be in the middle, right? Holding on to the potentials of the non-modern against fetishistic attachments to nothing but modernity in the conventional English language in the US. All this is very healthy indeed. I'm getting some signs by Fernando. Let me just then close down. Let me just close down with what I have. I'm happy to send you the paper later. I have a very quick rendering of Serge Kruszycki's History of Mentalities, a very interesting, and again, my own I'm simply engaging now with 5 books that I've read recently. I'm not claiming that's all there is in the landscape, but there need to be books that that ambitious from a historical standpoint. So I'm simply engaging with Serge Bursinski, I'm engaging with Mignolo with the darker side, but since you have my blog, you don't have to look at my face right now. You could just go back to your room tonight and just read it and enjoy it, and then critique it later. And then I did not have time to engage with what I think, because also I arranged the books in some kind of line of increasing, for me, persuasion. So then there's a great book that I would recommend to all of you, Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital by Vivek Cheever. It's a book that just recently came, and I find that book very convincing in relation to articulation of, for one thing, social relations, social hierarchies, social groups, frames of intelligibility.